So we'll start with the first paper that will be presented by Lawrence Haddad, and I feel kind of silly in a sense introducing a lot of these people who are well known to all of you. I'm not a scientist or an agricultural expert, but a journalist, and so I've talked to a number of them as sources for stories. But I will give kind of a brief intro to everybody and to our whole panel, and then we'll get going. Lawrence, of course, is the director of the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex and the current president of the UK and Ireland's Development Studies Association. Full disclosure, my wife is from County Tipperary, so we might have a bit of Irish partiality from time to time up here. Lawrence is a member of the lead expert group for the UK Government Foresight Program on the Future of Food and Farming, and of the steering committee of the high-level panel of experts of the UN's Committee on World Food Security. As many of you know, he's long been researching the intersection of poverty, food insecurity, and malnutrition from posts such as in the Philippines and India and South Africa. And this is a most fascinating paper that he'll be presenting. That'll be followed by a lively discussion and response from a very distinguished panel. There's Roger Beachy, the aforementioned Roger, and we'll have a quorum of Rogers or almost a majority of Rogers on the panel, so that's always good, a very rare occurrence. And Roger was appointed to be the first director of the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, NIFA, in October of 2009. And that's an organization that's responsible for awarding funds for research, extension, and education for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Prior to that appointment, he served as the founding president of the not-for-profit Donald Danforth Plant Science Center in St. Louis, Missouri. Dr. Beachy is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and is internationally known and renowned for his groundbreaking research on developing virus-resistant plants through biotechnology. He has served on numerous boards and committees, including the board of the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, and the board of the NIDIS Center for Scientific Enterprise. And he currently serves as the president of the International Association for Plant Biotechnology. We also have Shangan Fan, also probably needs little introduction, director of the International Food Policy Research Institute, and he was appointed to that in December 2009. He joined IFPRI in 1985, a longtime veteran there, as a research fellow, and led IFPRI's program on public investment before becoming director of IFPRI's Development Strategy and Governance Division. And Dr. Fan's research, which has been widely published, has centered on pro-poor development and investment strategy and rural-urban linkages in developing countries like Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. We also have Ian McGillivray, who is an agricultural economist at the Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA. Ian represented Canada on the CGIAR for over 10 years in various capacities. And as principal advisor on agriculture, he now leads Canada's relations with IFAD and serves on the steering committee of the new Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, the wonderful acronym GASP. Hopefully it's not a last gasp effort. And maybe you can work on a new acronym for these guys. And that's administered by the World Bank. And in June 2010, Ian was awarded the President's Award for Excellence for his work in developing Canada's food security strategy. And we're also extremely fortunate to have also with us Mira Shekhar, the lead health and nutrition specialist with the Human Development Network at the World Bank. And Mira leads the bank's work in scaling up its investments in nutrition, develops corporate strategy, advises country teams on design and development of nutrition investments, and is the bank's policy liaison on nutrition with its many partners. She's been actively engaged in the G8 agenda setting processes in Japan in 2008 and Canada this past year, and in the development of the Scaling Up Nutrition Framework for Action. So that's the powerful panel that we all have, and we'll start with Lawrence and his presentation. So take it away, Lawrence. Thank you. I'll get that out of the way.
Thank you, Roger. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you so much to the Harvest Plus team, to Howdy and Bonnie and everyone else for inviting me. Thank you to you for coming and listening. I know I'm supposed to be here as a keynote presenter, but I couldn't resist commenting on one of Howdy's slides that he showed you earlier. Two comments. One was that the ratio of true believers to true skeptics, I would say, was completely on its head in 1994 at the first conference that I was at, that Howdy organized in Annapolis. And the ratio had shifted a little bit at the Los Baños 1999 conference, and it's great to see that it's completely turned around at this conference. The 5 people in the audience who are not believers, there will be a secure card to take you to your hotel at the end of the day. Okay. The lanyards, what they didn't tell you, the lanyards are color-coded. So we know who you are. The other comment I have to make is because of what Roger said about the 2 Rogers on the stage. I was really pleased to see so many economists in the audience, because the last time Lawrence Kent and I were at a workshop was in Seattle. And he and I were the only economists there, but there was another guy there called Lawrence as well. So that was the first workshop I've ever been to where there were more Lawrences than economists. But this is not the case here either, so I'm pleased to see so many economists. I'm going to try and be a bit provocative. The title to my presentation is quite telling. They're not always quite telling, but this one's quite telling. From Harvest Plus to Harvest Driven, so keep that one in your minds. Agriculture for nutrition, that's another part of the title that you should keep in your minds. And then potential, elusive, and realize. I'm going to try to touch on all of those words or phrases in the presentation. And I said the first annual conference down there just to freak Bonnie out, okay? Overarching question, what is agriculture for? I don't teach too much at IDS, but I do teach a course on food and nutrition. And one of the questions I ask my students, my graduate students, is, what is agriculture for? And they find it a really hard question to answer. Is it about food production? Is it about nutrients? Is it about income generation? Is it about livelihoods? Is it about nutrition? Hardly anyone ever says it's about nutrition. So my presentation is to think about why that is the case and to try and make some suggestions for how to change that. My 3 sub-questions, and the paper is organized around these 3 questions, is what are the potential pathways between ag and nutrition? I won't spend too much time on that because I think many of us know those. How often are those pathways created and traveled? And then finally, what needs to be done to increase the chances of those pathways linking up agriculture and nutrition? So a very immodest set of goals for a very short paper. These are basically the answers to my questions, just to give you a bottom line on them. There are many pathways. I think there's much room for improvement in linking them up, and I've got some ideas for how to do that. So the first question, what are the potential pathways? I'm having a hard time reading that, but I think I can. They're very well known, very well known. They're around increasing the supply of nutrients, whether to be consumed on farm or purchased through the market. Then there are major income effects from increased farm productivity, both on farm and crucially off farm through backwards and forwards linkages. We know all this stuff. There's lower food prices, which is effectively an increase in income, especially if farmers can generate increased profits through lowering their costs, even while food prices diminish for the majority of the population who are net food purchasers. And then there's some post-harvest added value activities that can increase nutrition. All of those, it seems to me that all of those activities within agriculture can be enhanced to have a bigger nutrition impact or a bigger pro-poor impact through 3 things actually. Pro-poor governance, approaches that empower women, and applying explicitly a nutrition lens to agriculture. So pro-poor governance means thinking about how institutions and incentives can be set up to really address those at the bottom 20–40% of the income distribution. Approaches that empower women to improve their agency to work the rules of the game, but even more powerfully to shape the rules of the game. And then finally, putting a nutrition lens on a range of agriculture activities, and we know that those work. Those generate improved nutrition, and we again have a multitude of terms that we use to talk about improved nutrition, right from improved energy availability and consumption, right down through to linear growth and body mass index. All of these things are underpinned, it seems to me, by an environment that's enabling for nutrition. And that's a mix of carrots and sticks, seems to me. I think the agriculture community has very little reason to want to do something about nutrition unless it's incentivized, and sometimes negatively incentivized, to do so. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The second question I wanted to pose is, how often are these pathways created and traveled? So the first bubble there reviews the macro evidence. What's the evidence about how agricultural growth affects poverty reduction and nutrition? Is there any macro, sector-wide, country-level evidence on this? And again, the evidence is fairly mixed, fairly inconclusive, although it tends towards the positive in terms of agriculture having a positive impact on nutrition. So in terms of cross-country regression results, take them or leave them, the evidence there, and these are all studies from the last year or two, show that positive results. Agricultural productivity and growth tend to have positive impacts on poverty reduction. They tend to favor those at the bottom, in the bottom quintile of the income distribution, so that's good. The country studies, these are from India and Brazil, are slightly more mixed, slightly more nuanced, and methodologically they're probably a bit more sound than the cross-country studies. So we've got to balance the positive story from the cross-countries with the slightly more mixed from the country studies. Agricultural growth and nutrition impacts, there actually aren't that many studies on this. I was reading with interest a study by Hedy, I think from IFPRI, which is updating some stuff I did about 10 years ago with Lisa Smith. And he finds some more positive than negative results for agricultural growth and nutrition. Again, it's a cross-country study, but again, there aren't that many of them out there. The second part of this is, so at the macro level, the story seems fairly positive. What about at a more granular level? And here I think the data are pretty disappointing. This slide is a little bit out of date, and it's about 12 to 18 months out of date. So that was the situation in mid 2009, maybe late 2009. So SPEAR, which is the CGIAR's impact assessment program, out of 761 impact evaluations between 95 and 2008, only 83 looked at impacts of agricultural interventions and productivity on income or nutrition. So I don't think that's very many. JPAL, which is the MIT Poverty Lab, again, it's actually late 2009. Lots of stuff on their website, only 5 evaluations in agriculture, and they're all in Kenya. 3IA, which is the new organization you know about, run by Howard White, again, only in its first round, only 2 of 18 of the impact evaluations in agriculture. And Align, which is an initiative that I'm working with, did a review of some foundation proposals and found that only 6 out of 50 of them had any impact plans in them whatsoever. How often are pathways created and traveled? Part 3. Even when we do have impact studies, they're not terribly well organized. Howdy said to me when he was reviewing this paper, he said, so what did these 83 studies in the SPEAR website, what did they say? And I said, well, I either go through the 83 studies or I look for a systematic review. There are no systematic reviews, very, very few. This is commonplace in health. It's becoming more common outside of health, but I don't think it's very commonplace in agriculture. There's a systematic review done by Jimena Del Carpio last year, which was interesting, but it didn't go all the way through to impact on income and nutrition. So we really need some systematic reviews that have protocols about which studies are included and which aren't, and they're quality adjusted. And then they help you build up a systematic picture, and you can do some meta-analyses, very much in the same way that Pardee and Alston did back in the late 1990s. And then finally, looking at the biofortification studies, again, I may be a bit out of date, but I couldn't find any impact evaluations on nutrition outcomes. I'm sure they're in works, I'm sure they're in peer review, but I actually haven't seen any of them yet. So when you put all those things together, I think it's quite difficult to answer that question. How often are the pathways created and traveled? I think the evidence is not great, but my guess is that there's plenty of room for improvement. So the third question, what needs to be done to increase the chances? And this is where you get to creating an enabling environment for nutrition. So the first thing I'd like to suggest is we need to do much more work on using modern technologies to map hunger and malnutrition. Our speaker earlier mentioned, I think it was Michael Lipton, raised the issue of measuring food production and food output, how weak it is in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, measuring hunger and malnutrition is pretty weak everywhere, it seems to me, especially hunger. Malnutrition is a bit better because we have mix and DHS surveys, but they don't come out very often. So we're not very good at measuring things in real time. I was at a Standing Committee on Nutrition meeting in late 2009, and I put my hand up and asked the speaker who was presenting the latest nutrition data, what's been the impact of the 2007-2008 food price spike on undernutrition? And he said, I don't know the answer because we don't know yet. And that's 18 months after the crisis. We still don't know the impact. We can guess, but we don't really know what the impact is. So this is an example from Malawi that UNICEF and Columbia University are using frontline SMS and rapid SMS to measure nutrition status and measure hunger rapidly and get feedback in real time. Why is that important for agriculture and nutrition? Well, it will help understand it'll help us understand where stunting is an issue perhaps, and where female labor will be taken away from agriculture into caring for children, for example. It might help us understand where there are vulnerabilities in this season that need to be addressed in next season's planting, and so on and so forth. Next example of how to create an enabling environment for agriculture and nutrition is to capitalize on the increasing need to demonstrate impact. In the environment that I work in a sort of a day-to-day basis in the UK, the Department for International Development and the UK government in general has a relentless focus now on impact assessment. If you can't measure the impact, it doesn't really exist. Now, I think this is a real challenge for agriculture. As I think you saw the evidence earlier, we're not terribly good at measuring the impact of the work we do right through to the human impact, through to income and through to nutrition. I don't know if you agree with me, but I've just done a review of the literature and I couldn't find a whole bunch of stuff. If any of you've got some counter evidence to that effect, I'd really like to hear it. But I think here is a prime opportunity for agriculture to capitalize on this impact focus now. What better way to do that than to make the links between agriculture and nutrition? Nutrition is the ultimate human development indicator. It doesn't rely on a whole range of prices that income and consumption data do. It's not easy to demonstrate the impact, but if you can, it's very powerful. And agriculture really needs to get on this bus because if it misses it, it's really going to suffer 5 years, not now, but in 5, 7, 10 years' time. I'm going to skip this because I think I'm going too slowly, but I'm not going to skip it. Growth diagnostics. In the economics literature, in the economic growth literature, and agriculture is a big part of the economic growth literature, right? It's one of the main wealth creators in many countries. There's a whole move towards thinking about economic growth in a different way. Instead of thinking about it as the barrel on the left-hand side, the barrel on the left-hand side says, whatever we do, whatever input, whatever asset, whatever policy we put in place to promote economic growth, it's going to add to economic growth, right? So it's additive. All the planks are additive this way. And the more planks you have, the more horizontal planks you have, the more water the barrel can hold, the more growth you'll have. The economists who were focused on growth are now changing the way they think about this, spurred on by ministers of finance who say, you've given me 30 things to do. Which one do I do first? Which one's the constraining one? Which one's the limiting one? Which one do I prioritize? Now they've started modeling economic growth with these horizontal planks. In other words, there's one. If one plank is very short, all the water will come out of the barrel at the level of that short plank. It doesn't matter how high the other vertical planks are, that one short vertical plank is going to be the weak link in the chain of economic growth. And I think we've got to start thinking about nutrition in much the same way. We each of us have our own sort of pet intervention for nutrition, and this provides, this makes gives people who in government huge headache. Is it fortification? Is it supplementation? Is it biofortification? Is it home gardening? Is it social protection? What is it? In order to give agriculture a very strategic role within the nutrition firmament, it seems to me we have to start thinking more strategically about nutrition in terms of national programs and national strategies. And I think there's a lot to be adopted and learned from the economic growth literature. This is a nutrition commitment index. This is my fourth point under enabling environment. Think about the MDGs. I think the MDGs are important, obviously. They're very important. They're a rallying call for the global community and increasingly at the national level for what needs to be done. It talks about the values we have as a global and national community. But they're not very good as an accountability mechanism, right? I can't hold USAID or the Irish government or the Tanzanian government terribly accountable for their failure to meet an MDG, because they'll say, well, you know, lots of things contribute to whether an MDG is attained or not. This is an initiative at its early stages, and it's quite raw, from an NGO that we work with called ActionAid. They're trying to measure the commitment to hunger reduction and malnutrition reduction, as well as the actual outcomes. I think it's very important that we do this, because if we don't measure commitments to hunger reduction, then we can't hold actors accountable. So Feed the Future. I'd really like to see Feed the Future and the Global Health Initiative put in place milestones and indicators that allow us, the public, to hold them to account, not for whether hunger and malnutrition in Tanzania or Uganda or Ethiopia was reduced by a quarter or by half or by 10%, but whether they said they would do the things they said they would do, whether they've done those, whether they've spent the money where they said they would spend it, whether they've helped develop policies, whether they've invested in research. I think those kind of indices are very important to create a sense of accountability and transparency. And that's going to be very important for I'd like to see the CGIAR do the same thing. The CGIAR talks about nutrition and how important it is. Let's have some accountability indices that we can all hold the CGIAR to account. And then finally, all of this takes leadership. And in the paper, I somewhat flippantly said, where is the next generation of Howdy Boerses going to come from? It's rather a scary thought, I must say. I think Howdy would be the first to agree with me. But really, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him, really. I mean, he's this ability to bring together the social sciences, the agricultural sciences, and the nutrition sciences is a rare one, a really rare thing. And I can't see too many leadership programs and master's programs and PhD programs around the world who are doing this. And I'm worried about the next generation, the 20-somethings coming through. And this is an example of one program that I worked with the MacArthur Foundation on developing this. I was one of the advisory panels on the Masters in Development Practice. It's nothing to do with agriculture and nutrition, but it tries to bring together social sciences, natural sciences, health sciences, and management sciences together in practice, policy, and research. And I think we need some new master's programs around something like this. There's something similar to this, I think, at Tulane or maybe Emory, but there aren't many programs like this, and I'd like to see Indian master's programs and Brazilian master's programs and Chinese ones, preferably all networked globally. So this is my conclusion, Roger. High productivity agriculture, yes, that's a given. We want that. We need that. It's desperately needed. Africa, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa are not going to generate the necessary economic growth without that. But we need the right governance and gender to make sure that those, how we prioritize interventions, how we assess their risk, how we regulate them, how we make sure poor people's voices are heard. Those institutions and incentives need to be in place as well. And the gender dimensions obviously have to be in place, but not just in a downstream way, but in a very important upstream way. I don't know how many women are going to be on the panels over the next 2 days, but I'm worried if there aren't, I don't see too many women coming through the ranks in these in these kinds of fields of bringing together different disciplines. I think that's a real issue. And if you can do that, if we can do those two things, add in enabling environment for nutrition, I think we've really got something. But it's not easy. So this is my final slide, Roger. From Harvest Plus to Harvest Driven. I don't quite know how Harvest Plus was named. I wasn't around when it was named. A bit like the seminal moment when biofortification was coined. But one interpretation, I'm not saying it's the right one, but one interpretation can be, we'll do this Harvest Plus thing because it doesn't seem to hurt yields. So we'll do it. The harvest is protected and we get this extra stuff. You could interpret it different ways. But I think the rubber really hits the road with agriculture and nutrition when yields, the typical metrics of agriculture get hurt by introducing nutrition objectives. That's when things get really exciting and really fractious and really difficult. And my sense is that while agriculture can never be the prime shaper of nutrition, there's just too many other things that affect nutrition. It can never be the prime shaper. I would never hold to that role. It seems to me, I'm not a nutritionist, I'm not an agriculturalist, that nutrition should be the prime shaper, at least of public agriculture, public investments in agriculture. Because if it isn't, what else is agriculture for? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lawrence. I found that the paper, as I had read it before, and then just to see this presentation, to be fascinating and really thought-provoking, and particularly as I think all these indicators and indices and impacts, and the more that one could show that, is certainly a way to really capture people's imagination of why this is all important, and to carry this forth beyond the experts and the eminent people gathered here. And I know that's something that Feed the Future is also looking for some traction on, that how do we make people really engage and have them motivate and capture their imagination that this is an important program that everybody needs to support and get behind. Now we'll proceed with the panelists and their responses and discussion. And I guess I think we'll do it from sitting here, so we don't have to be jumping back and forth. And there's that little box on the floor that's like a stoplight with a green, yellow, and red. Lawrence was paying attention to it. It's very good with the timing. So that'll give you an indication of kind of the time, the 5-minute span or something. And then Lawrence will either respond to each of the individual things, or he can do it at the end, or whatever moves him by what is said. So I guess we'll just go alphabetically and start with Roger.
Thanks. Is there a slide advance guy there?
Oh, there is. Yep. Let me bring that.
And I'm really challenged to do anything in 5 minutes, but I'll do my best. The
red light will be flashing.
I know. I'm afraid of it. Just to bring you a little bit of understanding of where nutrition is in the Department of Agriculture, I have this first slide. And then the second is that we do a lot in training of nutritionists in the USDA. Very much of it is in the Agriculture Research Services. And if you know the USDA at all, you know that we have there are eight nutrition laboratories, and they are focused heavily in this area of human nutrition. Now, within my agency, there's also a strong focus in two areas of nutrition, one in nutrition per se and one in childhood obesity. And I want to talk a little bit about NIFA, but then I want to respond to Dr. Assad's comments. And so I was challenged here with trying to read my text or describe the agency with which I work. But the health challenge is an important one, and we have in our discussions linked health and nutrition along to agriculture. It's in early days to do that, Dr. Assad, but it's there, and it's an increasingly important part of our activities. And in so doing, we've changed the nature of our research organization in two parts that are important here. One, There is an institute we have described an Institute for Food Safety and Nutrition in NEFA. And as was indicated earlier, this is the part of the government agency that provides competitive grants programs for our extramural partners and universities. And there's a Center for International Programs. We can talk about this as it talks about the Feed the Future initiative. But certainly the relevance of nutrition to health is indisputable. And as Dr. Assad lays out his strong case to indicate that speaking of food and agriculture in the absence of consideration of nutrition does a great disservice to those that we seek to serve. And as you heard earlier, this administration's focus with the Feed the Future initiative and the global alliances is a testament to that. But the local situation is far different than the situation in developing economies, at least the one in the U.S. And the work that we discussed today is in a far different context than the awareness of what's important in the U.S. per se. And as you know, my agency is targeted with focusing on U.S. challenges and U.S. agriculture, not on international, except through the partnerships. The food system in our country and many other countries provides choices to most of us. And it's up to us to choose wisely or unwisely. But we're here today to discuss those who are less able to choose, and those that live on very low incomes, and those for which purchase of a tomato is out of reach, even if it is present in the local market. Many of us here have had experiences in developing economies and driving with folks who have only enough funding for starch and can't buy the vegetable. And we're struck by the challenges that are in those countries that are not here. The issue is, of course, poverty per individual or per family, the root cause of inability to diversify incomes or a diet for many of those that are under or badly nourished. And the linkage between agriculture and economy, of course, is well known. It's about poverty. The challenge of increasing availability of diet choice with food options is great, perhaps beyond the scope of this meeting, but may come down to an income base. I'm convinced that it is not in those seats of power that those who are in those seats of power are blind to the calories versus nutrition discussion, at least too much so. So I agree again with Dr. Assad about the importance of bringing this to a focus. But the will to act is missing from those in power in developing economies, and missing in large part from those in wealthy economies that lack the expertise or knowledge to know how to implement change. So lest we forget about the issue, we must continue to keep this issue front and center. And while we look for ways to increase awareness about the quality as well as the quantity of calories, we must also focus on generating sufficient wealth to give choice, all the while focusing on women who make the difficult choice of who gets what to eat and where the next meal will come from. An alternative to providing choice in diets is to increase micronutrient content of nutrient-poor foods, and we've heard reference to that already. The major focus in many of these studies is on starch-rich crops, many of which are poor in micronutrients. In the early 1980s, I was amongst a group of scientists who were early adopters of genetic engineering technologies in plants. In addition to the work that we did in developing virus-resistant crops, we also worked to alter protein composition and quality in seeds in the mid-80s, with the hope to improve nutritional composition of those proteins. Indeed, as soon as plant genetic engineering technology was developed, scientists around the globe were designing experiments to increase nutrient content more than 25 years ago. Most of us started with well-focused targets, but others of us followed knowledge that we knew, the biochemical pathways that led to micronutrient increase or where things go in cells, rather than on nutrition per se. And there was little or no interest in granting agencies 25 years ago in focusing on this topic. In fact, there was little or no interest in the private sector in investing in these technologies and the science that would lead to it. I followed the work of friends, including Ingo Petrikis and Dean De La Penna and Dan Galli and many others who used their knowledge about plant biochemistry and metabolism to make changes in components of plants that serve as micronutrients. In about 2004, we started work on folic acid because of a suggestion by a colleague at Monsanto Company who had dropped the project. In the early years, choices of which micronutrients to increase was based on literature discussions of deficiencies in plants that were part of the food chain. In some cases, the choices were informed by knowledge of an interest in the pathway per se, rather than an interest in nutrition. The question soon became, however, so what if you're successful? Would the paying consumer pay for improved levels of vitamins or minerals? In the late 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, the answer was no. The answer was no. At the Danforth Center, we spent perhaps $50,000 researching that with the food companies. No, they wouldn't pay. And if there's no interest in paying for something, then those of us that use biotechnology, the question would be who would pay the cost of deregulating the technology if consumers weren't interested in paying for an improved product. About 10 years ago, some of us proposed, therefore, that the intellectual property developed that would lead to increased nutrition be donated as a public goods. I still think that's a good idea. We were all very pleased when the technology gained higher levels of acceptance to the point that we have this conference today, and hope that the pull for a product would in fact create momentum and finally bring together metabolic engineers, synthetic biologists, nutritionists, agriculturists, social and economic scientists, and consumers to pull the products to the consumer community. While the second decade of genetic biofortification research sees more acceptance of GE as a tool for biofortification to address the poor nutrition in resource-constrained consumers, many questions remain and hurdles need to be cleared before the technology goes mainstream. If we think it's been difficult in developing the first round of crops, I'm not quite sure what we can expect in the acceptance in the regulatory community and in the consumer community on GE foods that have higher nutrition. Some of us are optimistic. Others of us are cynical after spending 25 years in the field of plant biotechnology. And we look forward to it, but aren't convinced that we know how to get there yet. But the piece that's missing is something that Dr. Assad mentioned, I think it was mentioned earlier, the linkage between the outcomes of what we eat and health and well-being is not well enough documented. I think that's leading the consumer to some challenges. I should say that Dr. Francis Collins from the NIH and some of us from NIFA and the National Science Foundation have begun a first set of discussions, and we will be convening a workshop in the new year to bring people together to talk about this linkage between nutrition, immune development, and health and nutrition in a new way, and create perhaps a study section and a research granting agency focus in the next year that would do this, would look at these closer links and bring some strong academic science to bear on it. So perhaps that's where ARS and others of us in the lab in this room who are nutritionists can find some hope that it not only be coming from the donor agency, the donor community per se, the Gates Foundation and others, and USAID, but from the science agencies.
Thank you, Roger. Lawrence, did you want to say anything now or wait?
I just got a question. That might. Thanks, Roger. My question is, where does agriculture and nutrition come together within NIFA?
It comes in the Institute for Food Safety and Nutrition. We have developed program projects that link social science and economics and nutrition and agriculture in our programs. However, it's got a low funding base in this year. There are grants for individuals to work together, but no large sharing a grant that cuts across all of those communities. On the other hand, we do have a fellowship program for NIFA fellows, pre-doctoral and postdoctoral fellows, and we are encouraging these cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary study between nutrition and agriculture. It's there. It's not a funded priority because much of what we do is directed through interest of Congress, and I hold it, as I said earlier in my remarks, I don't think the policymakers have faced it yet, nor are they willing to consider how that might be valued. I think the real value of calories versus nutrients is what you mentioned is a key one.
And are there cross-institute mechanisms within NIFA? There are the 5 or 6 institutes.
Oh, indeed. The crosscuts are essential. We're a new organization, and what we've done right off the bat is create cross-cutting teams that make sure that those who do production and those that do nutrition studies are closely linked. We can't do it any other way. I think more important is the recognition that the nature of what plants make and all their components and what they do, the fundamental sciences of that, and which of those are important in nutrition, which comes through the studies in agriculture, and then how they impact health comes through the NIH. I I'm quite hopeful that that this initiative will lead to something fruitful. And it really follows on the NRC report of about a year ago that talked about the new challenges in the new biology in the future. It really is about interaction between health and well-being and nutrition and sustainability and environment. All of that wraps together.
Yep, please.
Just wanted to, I was really encouraged to hear how you're going to reach out and engage with regular consumers around GM and biotechnology. My institute's just done we're doing a lot of work around trying to understand UK taxpayer attitudes to international development. There's a special obligation because the UK has ring-fenced its aid budget, one of the few to do that. And so there's a huge pressure to demonstrate that it's having an impact more than ever, but also a huge impact to minimize wastage and corruption. One of the studies we did looking at the UK said that people are skeptical, but interestingly enough, corruption is not one of the big drivers because everyone we surveyed thought corruption was fairly high. So it actually wasn't a differentiator in terms of whether you believe in aid or not. Interestingly, the thing that was the big differentiator was whether you thought aid was effective or not. And I do think that things like biofortification that are tangible, if the nutrition impacts bear out the promise, it's tangible, it's not something that can be easily sidelined and wasted, are going to be very vital. And I would just encourage you to keep engaging with those potential users, not the users of the biofortified food, but the US taxpayers basically, because I mean, I just quoted something you said. You never. I think you said you never cease to be surprised by the reaction. I guess my suggestion would be, try not to be surprised. Try to engage these folks really early on in the process, and I think once they see that there are benefits to people who are malnourished, the support will be there. That's what the studies in the UK are showing.
I think you're right. I think part of the surprise is it keeps me alert no matter who says something. I have a look of surprise on my face, and maybe it helps. But I am pleased to see that the work coming out of the Golden Rice Project, which is now nearly 15 years old. It's a first indication that success can come, and so I'm looking forward to the work of Harvest Plus. So we have something to say. Right now there aren't many stories, and we need good stories. We need outcomes that can show not only to the grist and to Rolling Stone and those who are cynical and skeptical about science and technology with relation to food, but those who would support it through project support. And I think it will come, but I wish it had started 25 years ago, because there were lots of us in the field that got into biotech because we saw that as a way to address malnutrition. And like many things, it just takes a long time to come around. And I think largely it was because we felt that the private sector in this country was not willing to engage and to get involved in this. One of the reasons that we think maybe the best thing to do is to demonstrate in developing economies, and maybe it will finally come back to the developed economies, that this is useful.
Thank you. Schengen Fan. Oh, the clicker. Yep. Good catch.
Well, it's right. It's really a pleasure to be here. I have watched the Harvest Plus grow from a little baby. I remember when I joined IPRI, so Hardy was conceptualizing this baby, nurtured the baby. Now today that baby has grown to be a very strong man or woman, and who is running, probably can become stronger, even bigger. Lawrence, I read your paper very carefully. I have to say I agree most of your statements, arguments there. I just wanted to add, maybe emphasize several things here. Okay, the agriculture and nutrition links, I think, Lawrence, you gave a very good description about other pathways. But one channel I wanted to emphasize is agriculture growth generates government revenues. So the government can use these revenues for targeted nutrition and social safety net programs. So that importance should not be ignored. Or obviously other pathways, for example, household income, household production, contributed to household welfare directly, nutrition directly. But the macro side, the revenues from the agricultural growth should not be ignored. Then as my second point is the growth patterns matters. It's not just the agriculture growth as a block or as a whole. Where does growth come from? Whether growth comes from smallholders, from large farms, whether growth comes from stable crops, from cash crops, or from female or male-headed households, or less developed or development regions. All these patterns would have tremendously important implications on nutrition outcome. So that's the second point I wanted to emphasize. So indeed, some of the IPRI study shows that the composition of agricultural growth is very important in terms of reducing undernourishment. For example, here in Tanzania, so every 1% growth in maize production would have needed to almost 2% reduction in calorie poverty. So 1% agriculture, 1% maize growth will lead to 2% reduction. The pulse is 1.5. Pulse is 1.8. The sorghum 1.5. The livestock 0.7, 0.8. So all these different composition of growth really matters in terms of hunger reduction. Well, obviously we can expand this study to include the reduction in malnutrition, micronutrients deficiency. So, and another important element is the priorities of the sequences. We know that we need a comprehensive approach to tackle the malnutrition problem. Agriculture growth, nutrition interventions, biofortification. By the way, biofortification has a unique role here to play. It focuses on stable crops, it's cost effective. It also avoids sort of the fluctuations caused by the government policies. Once the nutrients are in the crop, the government policy is not going to affect that. So to tackle the malnutrition, we need a comprehensive approach. Growth, nutrition interventions, supplements, even the women's status, the improvement of health nutrition facilities. So all this matters. Now the question is, how do we set the priorities? We know government resources are very limited. So where do we start? And the priorities of sequencing must vary by country or even sub-region within the same country, and it may change over time. I just wanted to give you some of the examples in some of the countries, China, Vietnam, and India. So China, Vietnam started its agricultural reforms in the late 70s and to the mid 80s. So that sort of rapid growth from the reforms has really improved the malnutrition, really reduced malnutrition, improved the health status of many people. So large-scale interventions in the agriculture sector. Then they moved towards a more targeted approach as the first sort of low-hanging fruits were captured. So they moved towards a more targeted approach to different regions, to different groups of population. And then they begin to use the nutrition programs to target the children and the women. Now they move their priority towards overnutrition and obesity. So you can see the changes of the priorities, changes of the emphasis over time. Now in the case of India, now the question is whether it's lack of agriculture growth that is the major reason of the higher malnutrition rate, or is it because the improvement of women's status, or the improvement of rural infrastructure, drinking water, access to health facilities, and whether we should use more targeted nutrition programs. So the priorities sequencing do change over time, and they vary by country. And another emphasis we have not paid enough attention is the national level accountability. So we have discussed about the donor agency accountability. We have discussed about even here in US, the National Research Institute's accountability. I think more importantly is at the national level of the developing countries. Can we make the Ministry of Agriculture accountable for nutrition outcome? Can we make sure that the Ministry of Health will use agriculture as one of the solutions to solve the health and nutrition problems? And how can we promote interdisciplinary communication and coordination among government, nonprofit, and private agencies? And this is very important, particularly important in developing countries. Then clearly we need accountability system and incentive system in developing countries. I very much agree with you. The donor agencies, CGIAR, need this system, but also the developing countries need that system. Now the CGIAR obviously takes this issue very seriously. As you know, during the Green Revolution in the last 30, 40 years of CGIAR's existence, CGIAR has very much focused on technology, productivity, more production, and recently natural resources. So now it's changing. The CGIAR has really broadened its goals to explicitly include health and nutrition as its goals. As a result of that, one of the 15 so-called mega programs, huge and large programs within CGIAR, is to link agriculture to health and nutrition. IPRI and International Livestock Research Institutes have coordinated the development of that mega program. So the link between agriculture and health and nutrition is one of the probably newest program within the CGIAR system. And that mega program has worked with 10 CGIAR centers. It's not just IPRI, not just IRI, not just Harvest Plus. Harvest Plus will be part of it. So it's a whole system. And obviously we worked with national research institutes and other stakeholders in both developed and developing countries. Just for your information, to even move this agenda forward, to make that link much stronger between agriculture, health, nutrition, IPRI is planning a large conference in India next February 10 to 12, to look at this very same issue. How can we really leverage agriculture for better nutrition and health? 2 years ago, my predecessor was challenged by the Prime Minister of India. Why India, despite the rapid agriculture growth, even agriculture growth, the malnutrition rates are still very high. So it's a national shame, it's a curse. So how can we unlock this dislink between agriculture and the nutrition? So we will try to bring the different communities from agriculture, nutrition, health, were to continue this trend, but also different stakeholders, the private sector, the government, the research institutions, academia, to really look at the value addition, how we can really gain, to look at the entry point, we can unlock this link. And I welcome your participation to this important conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Shangan. Lawrence, any comments? Should we move to Ian or? Yeah, I think so. Or should we, however you would prefer. Should we move to all the panelists and then you want to discuss afterwards?
You'll never be able to get a microphone out of my hand, so
right.
Keep going. I'll start singing if you don't watch out.
Right.
Shangan, thank you for your comments. Really good. Ag revenues, agriculture generates income and revenues which are taxed, which can be, if civil society and the government choose to, be allocated towards nutrition reduction programs, and that's great. And I think that reinforces the idea that nutrition is agriculture is not just about agriculture is about wealth creation. It's a wealth creation activity. It's perhaps one of the most important private sector activities in many countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's vital. We're trying to align agriculture with the new wealth creation agenda in the UK, and I think it's not going to be too very hard a sell. However, agriculture has a special obligation. It's not just about producing widgets. It's about producing food and nutrients. So it does have a special responsibility, it seems to me, to to nutrition and food. And an agriculture that produces food but that's not interested in nutrition is a strange kind of agriculture, it seems to me. On agricultural growth patterns and where agriculture comes from, yeah, I mean, that's the point I was trying to make in that slide about granularity. We need to know a lot more about, we need to disaggregate the ag growth and try and find out more about it. Remember when we were at IFPRI together, we were always trying to figure out how can we extend the China and India work that you did, looking at different kinds of investment and different kinds of growth. You linked it to poverty, but we could never quite figure out how to do it for nutrition because the data weren't there. But I'd love to see much more of that kind of work happen. Priorities and sequencing, yes, at the country level, absolutely. And one of the words that's not on this backdrop here is politics. And we do tend to work in a sort of apolitical vacuum in agriculture, nutrition, and in development more generally. We're a bit scared of politics. But fundamentally, prioritization and sequencing is a political process, depending on political opportunities, problem opportunities, and capacities. And so we're in the middle of an opportunity right now. We're in the middle of a window where lots of things seem to be coming together. As our opening speaker, Ambassador Garvelink, said, lots of things are coming together right now to make agriculture and nutrition, to bring them to the table. And we must make sure that they are not just touching hands every few years, that they really begin to integrate at very deep levels. And that's what I was talking about with the master's level program. We need to get the people that you were 25, 30 years ago, we need to get them inculcated with this idea that agriculture and nutrition have something to offer each other. On accountability, yes, absolutely. I've just finished and national accountability is also very important. I just finished a peer review. I was one of the 2 peer reviewers for DFID. DFID is going through a big review of its bilateral aid programs, but also its multilateral aid programs, and it spends a lot of money on multilaterals every year. It spends $5 billion a year on multilaterals, on 46 multilaterals. And one of the key criteria, I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying this, one of the key criteria that DFID are looking at is, do the multilaterals, which doesn't include the CGIAR, by the way, do the multilaterals have an impact on the ground, at the human being level? That was a key driver for DFID. I think more and more donors are going to see this as a key driver. Can you demonstrate the impact of your work in a tangible, credible way at the human level?
Let's go to Ian McGillivray, and then we'll maybe then follow into Mira, so everybody has plenty of time. Thank you.
See if I can handle this. Let me start by thanking you, Lawrence. I must say, I cannot help but reflect our earlier conversation that probably we should be doing more together, Canada and CETA particular. Maybe, I know you'll hold me to account on what I've just said. I work for CETA. CETA in Canada is the Canadian International Development Agency. It's equivalent to USAID, CETA. Our budget is about $5 billion a year. When I hear that DFID just spends $5 billion a year on multilateral, I guess we're small. But we are talking about Canadian dollars, luckily, I think, when I left yesterday. You laugh, it won't be as cheap coming down to Canada as it has been in the last few years for all of you. Let me move to give you a perspective from a donor, one that has been at CETA for quite a long time. And I think the next slide is important because I think as a donor, this kind of message has to hurt. This is familiar to everybody who has been involved in investments to agriculture over the last many years. Essentially, when I joined CETA back in '84, it was 10 years after Henry Kissinger had said that over that 10-year period before I joined CETA, there wouldn't be a hungry child. Now, talk about accountability and meeting pledges, or put that in perspective and realize the kind of challenge that we're facing in terms of addressing the hungry people today. But by and large, this reflects, as I think Roger mentioned in one of his recent papers and in his book, this reflects probably a number of things like death by success, or being a victim of one's own successes. Mountains of butter, I think, was something that I learned at university in Canada. Essentially one that I think we can learn from, but I share this with you because most of my time at CIDA has been spent trying to reverse this, at least for Canadian support. And I think many of us who are in this room probably were shouldering this effort together. As support to agriculture declined, unbelievably, our work in support for food was not even considered basic enough to be fundamental for good health or nutrition. Now that might sound a little bit shocking, and at the time, around the mid-90s, we did reach out with IFPRI, particularly with Lawrence, to try to work on the linkages between food, nutrition, health, and we brought in environment. Schengen's point is one that we tried to make very strong. The important productive element of agriculture to be able to pay for any of our social activities in spite of the need for education and health. During this period, Canada became a leader in all of our specific or direct interventions to address the immediate causes. But I guess we can say if the opposite of a leader is a loser in terms of our support to agriculture. We stepped back, we didn't step out, but certainly we were part of the overall trend of decline. A key part to share with you is that food-based approaches for better nutrition were no match at all to the lives saved from providing supplements, nor were there any attempts to provide appropriate balance to address the underlying causes of nutrition. Investments in agriculture kept sliding unabated. But let's think about the consequences of this decline. We would have been further ahead in knowledge, in overall development. Think of the foregone income, the sluggish yield growth, support to women that has been mentioned, in fact, very well in Lawrence's paper, slowing technological change, and evidence of impact where we are just scratching the surface. Think of the importance of being able to understand the contributions that this inevitable crisis must now help us design adequate responses, let alone avoid a repeat. There is lost ground and there's much catching up to do. That's essentially what's coming from there. I thought next to share with you a very interesting little formula that came across a few years ago, where the pressure for change, when it's larger than the resistance to change, we get change. And I guess all of us who were closely linked to the food crisis of 2007, 2008, did lead us to that incredible pressure, not just with falling governments, but with the numbers that were staggering that went over 1 billion in terms of people hungry. Across the world, food and nutrition security now has become a priority. And more recently, we have an unprecedented breakthrough to place nutrition high on the international agenda with plans to scale up in a holistic, multi-sectoral, and coordinated way. This is quite incredible. For one, there is a better platform from which we can together bridge our divides and learn from each other. Essentially here, I guess, there's the pressure, and ultimately there's the change. But let me move forward. For how long will this momentum remain? I think we really have to think about this. Staying the course will not be easy. Looking back, what would our leaders have said was missing from the past? Where were we so unconvincing in our support to agriculture and nutrition? What could have been done differently? But looking forward, I think Lawrence in many ways has got it right. We need to do a lot more in terms of documenting, organizing, and framing our evidence on the role of agriculture's impact on nutrition and discerning the pathways. I think for too long, the focus on research on the nutritional quality beyond macronutrients of what is produced has often been missing, often crowding out it or in response of other important needs. This is why we in Canada feel that Harvest Plus is so timely. But for Lawrence, how does one get people to make good nutrition a priority? Possibly the weak relationship between income increases and nutritional status is partly due to the fact that those with the poorest nutritional status may not be experiencing enough improvement in incomes to make a difference. The fact that people generally do not value improved nutrition relative to other tangible things like a TV or a motorbike, which can be used immediately, whereas the positive impact of improved nutrition may take years to manifest. This is central if the goal is to improve nutritional results. Like Schengen, as a donor, we must ask how we work with our development partners to pick the importance of nutrition. This must be a shared priority. And have we lost a wonderful opportunity with CADP in this context? As some of you in this room may know, this is a framework for agricultural development. It takes a comprehensive approach towards agricultural development in Africa. And it includes diverse aspects of food security as safety nets and nutrition. But they are vastly under-recognized when compared to agriculture, i.e. production. As in many donor countries, national policies and programs are not integrated sufficiently to tackle these complex challenges. Why should we expect developing countries to have them integrated? And last, the underlying needs, we believe, rest on change for greater focus and a drive towards better documenting the effects of our work, the results, how to frame better the impact pathways, and importantly, measuring outcomes through nutrition indicators. My last little comment, Lawrence, is that we are developing an action plan for nutrition, and I think your paper certainly provides us a springboard as we look to mainstream nutrition in all that we do in natural resources. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. Lawrence, why don't we hear from Mira first, and then you can combine your responses to both of them because we want to make sure that Mira Shekhar has full voice. So please.
Thank you, Roger, and sorry, Lawrence, to take the mic away from you. It happens rarely, but
well, that was also part of my strategy. So that's.
I think several people this morning have talked about gender as a key issue in nutrition and in agriculture. And yet, as I look around this room, I think there's a gender issue to be addressed, and certainly on this panel here, but my shoulders are heavy. Not too broad, but heavy enough. I also want to confess, in the interest of the full disclosure issues, Roger, that you raised at the beginning, that I belong to the 5 people who said, I am a believer, but I'm also a healthy skeptic. And I want to stay in that place, primarily because some of the issues, Lawrence, that you touched upon in your paper, of the need for more evidence, the need for more results, and to be able to show we can actually make this happen at scale in the countries where it's needed most. I'm also going to do, so I do a lot of unconventional things. You heard some of those. I'm also going to do another unconventional thing, which is that I don't have a PowerPoint. I will just speak from some notes that I have here. Thank you. Lawrence, you raised a really important issue, and I'd like to believe that we can move in that direction, that nutrition should shape agriculture. I'd like to believe that we can make that happen. I was at a private sector meeting yesterday in New York City, and there too I was the token gender. I'm used to that. But you know, you can always depend on the private sector to do a reality check. And they said, somebody there said a wonderful thing. They said, and I'm going to look at my notes here from that meeting, food is a need. Nutrition is a want. Lack of, and this is, I'm trained as a nutritionist. It was very hard for me to hear that, but it's true. Lack of food is a visible travesty. Everybody can see a hungry individual and respond to that. And it's politicians, policymakers, everybody. Lack of nutrition is invisible. And I think the big challenge is to help make nutrition more visible to those who make decisions. This is part of the political commitment building agenda, and I think I'd like to have a conversation on that issue. Over the last couple of years, everybody's talked about the global food price spikes. How did the global community respond to that? With a gasp, right? The Global Agriculture Food Security Program and many other similar gasps. Who has responded to continuing malnutrition, chronic malnutrition in the world over the last 3, 4, 5 decades? What is the difference? The food issues are visible, the malnutrition issues remain invisible. So that's sort of my first point. I think unless we can make things, the nutrition issues visible, this objective of trying to make the links between the two will remain elusive. And I'm known as the eternal optimist, but Lawrence, if we can actually use nutrition to shape the agriculture agenda, boy, we are in a really good place. But I'm not as optimistic as that. As I said, the private sector helped to bring a reality check there. A second point I want to make is around institutional silos and incentives. I think one of the main reasons that we are not able to establish those links between agriculture and nutrition is because of institutional silos. Walk into any country, there is the Ministry of Agriculture that is driven by what has been said here, primarily production of food, economic growth. No Ministry of Agriculture that I have ever met is driven by nutrition objectives. And the same thing in the health agenda. No Minister of Health is thinking about how to link with agriculture. We failed miserably at country level in trying to make those connections. In institutions, IFPRI, bilateral organizations, many other research organizations, foundations, and even at the World Bank, I think we are struggling to break those silos. We want to break those silos. We're struggling to make break those silos. But I don't see a clear thing. The GASP, coming back to the GASP, big response in agriculture. It did not do the needful in terms of saying this is how we will link the agriculture investments with the nutrition agenda. Why is this happening? I think one is the obvious one we're all familiar with, turf issues. Ministry of Agriculture doesn't want to give space to health, and so on and so forth. A second thing is around what's been said earlier, accountability and how success is measured. And I truly believe that unless we can do a major paradigm shift in terms of how success is measured in both agriculture and health, we will not be able to be successful. And again, I remind you, I'm the eternal optimist. So A third issue, which I think is much more doable and in the shorter term, which is around lack of information on potential win-win options. And biofortification is clearly one example of that. But at the private sector conference yesterday, again, I met with somebody who is, and this brings me to my third point, so I'm going to end quite soon, which is around what called the WIFM principles. What's in it for me? And trade-offs related to that. At the private sector conference, there was a zinc miner who came up and made a presentation, fabulous, very interesting presentation. He talked about how adding zinc to fertilizer, and maybe many of you in this community know about that, would increase crop yields by 30%, would increase growth in the zinc industry, zinc mining industry, by 10%, and potentially, as those of you who know about the links between zinc and nutrition, could have a benefit on nutrition outcomes as well. Now, I learned this not from an ag colleague, not from a health colleague, but from an unusual suspect. And so I think keeping the doors open in having conversations with unusual suspects is really, really important. In terms of WIFMs, what's in it for me, and trade-offs, I think it's also really important to recognize that none of these ag nutrition linkages, even though the pathways look, or Lawrence has simplified them, worked very hard at simplifying some of them, I think they're really very complex, and there are very many trade-offs over there. Women in agriculture, you want that to happen for obvious reasons, income, participation, so on and so forth. But the data from agriculture tell us that women who participate in agriculture are thinner themselves. What does that mean for nutrition? We need to think about that. The data also tell us that women who participate in agriculture, some of your work, Lawrence, have less time for childcare. What will that mean for nutrition outcomes for kids? It's, I think, something for us to think about. Dietary diversity. Yes, we can make dietary diversity happen, but at what cost to economic growth and to agricultural productivity. Plants, Howdy and I have had this conversation a few times, plants that are being bred for, and correct me, Howdy, if I misstate, plants that are being bred for high nutrient content. There is a huge amount of research, much of it from Harvest Plus, but there is parallel research ongoing on disease-resistant seeds as well. If I'm a farmer in Tanzania or Mozambique or India or anywhere else, which one am I going to have to choose? And these are trade-offs that we need to think about. The agriculture revolution, many people say, the green revolution, many people say that's the solution to nutrition. Let's remember that the green revolution came to Asia, big time in India, and yet India has the highest rates of malnutrition in the world. I'm one of the malnourished Indians from India. Continue to operate at lower cognitive levels. Let me finish by saying that these are lots of challenges, and we clearly, I don't want to be a pessimist. I think what we're seeing today in terms of the SUN framework, the Scaling Up Nutrition Framework for Action, this is the first time in history that the nutrition community has taken it to that level. It's also the first time in history that we've had somebody as committed as President Zelig at the World Bank. As the president of the World Bank, he's thumping the table and saying, can't you folks get your acts together and tell us how to link agriculture with nutrition? And we will meet with some of the foundations tomorrow, actually, on the margins of this meeting to help address some of those questions. So any inputs, comments on those would be most welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mira. That was a very clarion voice. Lawrence, any comments? Yeah, we got about 5-7 minutes or so, and then maybe time for one or two questions from the audience.
I'll be very quick, Roger. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Mira. Great set of comments, both of you. I mean, when you think about nutrition, it is a a very complex topic. It's multi-sectoral, it has multiple determinants. One can look at that in a very pessimistic way or a very optimistic way. Pessimistic, everything's got to happen, so why even bother? Optimistic, there are lots of opportunities to change the dynamic. When you think about nutrition, it's about coordination, it's about bridging, it's about leveraging, it's about making nutrition visible and malnutrition visible. All of those things, it seems to me, require the kind of pressure that Ian talked about. Because, as you say, Mira, the issues are complex. There may be some win-wins out there, but you've got to work hard to find them. They won't just come. And even when you do find them, and their potential, you've got to work hard like Howdy did to make them come to fruition. But even harder, you've got to work on the ones that are not win-wins. There are overall wins for nutrition, but they're not win-wins for nutrition and agriculture, and that's the really difficult set as well. So a part of my presentation was about how do you generate that energy? How do you generate that drive, that pressure? And I think it's through things like using ICTs more creatively to make sure that malnutrition is not invisible. It's about it's about donors and others incentivizing people in agriculture or wherever to have impact indicators that are nutrition related. It's about accountability mechanisms, new accountability mechanisms. It's about new ways of training, and it's about new institutional forms, it seems to me. So I think it's about all of those things. I'm not optimistic that agriculture will say, yeah, we should be shaped by nutrition. Of course not. I think it's a huge ask, especially in the private sector. In the private sector, I wouldn't expect that anyway. That's not what they're there for. But in the public sector, I would expect public sector investments to be focused towards A, the poor, and B, towards the outcomes that really count, nutrition. So I'm not an optimist in the sense of it will happen, but then I was quite skeptical of biofortification 16 years ago. I'm not now.
Thank you. No, keep that. Let's see if we got time for a couple of questions. David Lambert, with his microphone here. We've got at least 2 questions here if we want to.
David Lambert. I don't know whether we can pull up Dr. Haddad's barrel analogy, but that is a very powerful analogy, and I think that says it all. Every member of our Congress should examine that very closely, as should members of other parliaments around the world, because we see this plank that's the shortest plank, first 1,000 days, early child nutrition, and our politicians grumble about foreign development. They don't understand why we spend hundreds of millions of dollars on worthy objectives like post-harvest and education and capacity building, technical assistance, and yet we have 180 million children stunted. We wonder why we're not getting more results for our development dollars. If our politicians could understand this analogy, they would see where we need to change our priorities. Thank you.
Thanks. Where's our microphone people? Let's go over here. We'll take Owen aside. We'll have room diversity.
Good morning. This is Ashish Vele. I represent Nirmal Seeds, private sector company from India. This august body must be aware there is a lot has been discussed about the land markets in Africa. And many people from India, including the seed companies, are trying to invest in the land markets in Africa, mainly in Sudan and Ethiopia. And if you see what President Obama said 2 days back in Mumbai, that was also related to replicate the model of Green Revolution, what India did, to be replicated in Africa. I would feel and say what Mira referred in her presentation by saying that we may make mistake of only talking about production and yield levels, what India could achieve in last 30 years, but we may mislead ourselves by not talking about nutrition aspect of the food security. So this August body and Harvest Plus should develop a mechanism for the land markets in Africa, where we are also working as an Indian company, wherein instead of talking only about the food security and yield aspects, that needs to be shaped up as nutrition to shape up the agriculture in future. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, you asked a question in the last panel. Let's go here. The orange. Burnt orange.
Jack Winkler from London. Virtually all the speakers have at some point or another wanted better measures of the impact or the outcomes or the success of what we're doing with biofortification. It's fine, but it's all very abstract. Let me direct a question to Mira Shekhar, because she defined herself as a skeptic and asked the most brutal question: how do we measure success? Tell us, what kind of success measure would change your skepticism into belief?
Go ahead and answer. Yep, please.
Oh boy, all the easy questions.
We're waiting, right? With bated breath. Please.
Thank you. I actually, just to correct myself if I wasn't clear enough at the beginning, I didn't define myself as a skeptic. I defined myself as somebody who was in between a believer and a healthy skeptic. Healthy maybe, but malnourished.
An Indian malnourished skeptic,
That's
right?
correct, absolutely. Stunted, anemic, the works. I think the issue is not about coming up with better measures of success, but better definition of success. And so the distinction is very nuanced. The indicators for measuring success exist. They've been ratified by the technical community quite a bit. The challenge is that those indicators, those measures of success, are not being used by the agriculture community, or sometimes not even by the health community, to define success. So success is declared when production goes up. Success is declared when growth happens. Success is not declared if malnutrition rates go down. And I think that's what I'm pushing for. I hope that clarifies. Thank you.
Maybe one more. Where did we have? We'll do two more. This there, and then this gentleman here. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Just a comment on creating an enabling environment that Lawrence mentioned and that Schengen also alluded to. We have examples in Latin America of 3 countries that integrated biofortification into their national food and nutrition security plans. In the case of Cuba, it was led by the Nutrition Institute. In the case of Nicaragua, it was led by the Ministry of Agriculture. And in the case of Panama, it was led by the World Food Program. So we have some nice examples of how different sectors have worked together to get biofortification integrated into national nutrition plans. Thanks.
Thank you. Sir?
Thank you. Yes, in terms of agriculture and nutrition, I don't think our attitudes have changed very much for the last 25 years. In fact, by linking agriculture and nutrition always so closely, what we really do is we raise the concept of subsistence agriculture to an imperative. In other words, we should really go for good subsistence agriculture so that the small amount of land that people have, they can subsist upon. We never look beyond that point for development. In fact, agriculture does a great number of things besides producing food. There's a great deal of industrial agriculture as well. And that's associated with the development of different systems that can take advantage of industrial agriculture. So it's a little bit more complex than an individual sustainability. So to what extent does the idea of so closely linking nutrition to agriculture on the one hand, and even the idea of biofortification, by the way, having a single crop deliver everything rather than a mix of foods in a diet? I mean, we see the same thing in modern processed foods, where we try to put everything into one food. And we go away from the idea that we eat diets rather than single foods, a mix of foods in other sense. So, you know, to what extent do you think that this attitude, in fact, entrenches longer term the idea of subsistence agriculture as a development goal or imperative, rather than looking beyond that to hopefully creating a little bit of wealth so people have a choice in determining where their lives will go. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an interesting question. Lawrence will give you the last word on the panel. Oh. Well, Shangan, did you want to say something first, or
Okay.
Okay.
I'm happy for someone else to have the last word.
Okay, then.
That's very generous of you. Thank you, Roger. The private sector. The land grab stuff's really interesting. The land purchase stuff. I think it's potentially could be a very good thing. It could also be a very bad thing. And so what I'd like to see is something similar to the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative applied to the major land purchases. So I'm struggling a little bit to see the links with nutrition, but on that issue, I think it's a major governance issue. It could go badly, it could go well. It just depends on the governance, seems to me. On the 1,000 days and the plank point, thank you. You put it much more eloquently than I did. Thank you, that was great. On Bert's question, I think it's Bert, is that right? On impact, the question on impact, I think what would convince me, and I probably will see it over the next 2 or 3 days, is a study that has a very good experimental or quasi-experimental design that uses nutrition indicators that the nutrition community have agreed to, that shows a clear, unequivocal, independent effect of biofortification on nutrition status, however defined. I think the next question, I think that's a necessary but not sufficient one to get really excited about. The sufficient condition is whether you can scale this in a commercial, everyday context. And I know that's a big part of the conference. I'm really excited to hear some of that. But the innovation part is very different from the scaling part, and the sets of skills required for the two are very different. So one of my suggestions to the Harvest Plus team would be begin to partner with experts in scaling, because they're not the same as experts in innovation. And then finally, well, I've got a question for you about the Latin America one, but I'll come back to you later on. The question was, what did they have in common, those environments? But thanks.
Shangan, thank you.
Well, this is definitely not the final word. I think one of the problem is the market does not work in linking agriculture to health and nutrition. For example, biofortification. Farmers do not have incentive to produce because they don't see higher prices. Consumers lack knowledge, lack of information. So lack of information is one of the market failure problem. So we needed to understand that. So the market didn't work. So we needed to make sure the public interventions should correct that. I think, Lawrence, you're right that the sequencing and priority is a political process. Now the question is how can we influence that political process? So our agenda here is to bring the evidence, bring the information to that political making process so they can make the right choice, make the right priorities. So and the research-based evidence is still lacking. I agree with you. We do not have very clear, strong evidence to show which link is the strongest, where it has worked, where it has. Yeah, we do have enough anecdotal ad hoc evidence, but I think systematically, how can we bring the evidence out is still a question.
Can I just come back to this question over here, which is a very important one, which I forgot to mention.
You will have the last word.
Okay, sorry. But I wanted to come back to your question because it's one I hear this question a lot. The question was, is biofortification, is there a risk that biofortification will perpetuate a subsistence agriculture mentality? I actually don't think that's the case with biofortification. I think biofortification is all about working with people's current diets and current ways, current habits. I don't think it's about changing. I don't think it's about changing the way they consume. I don't think there's any danger of a less diverse diet as a result of biofortification. Though, if there are any studies and evidence out there, I'd love to see it. But my priors would be no. And in fact, I see it as a route towards this sort of breaking away from subsistence agriculture by, if it also does improve productivity, if it raises yield, and it's something that farmers want to do not for nutrition reasons, but for profit reasons, then obviously it's not going to be an issue. The really interesting cases will be where it cuts into profits, but we know it improves nutrition status. And it seems to me that's where the state has to come in and figure out a way of incentivizing farmers to do the thing that's going to have an impact, not on this generation so much, but on the next generation's ability to create wealth in the future.
Excellent point to end the panel with. Great panel. Let's have an applause. Wonderful, wonderful discussion.